The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters. Welcome back to the Personal Safety Show. I'm your host, Marcus Melnick from Firearm Mentor, and today I have with me retired police officer Walter Trentadue. This is a treat for me because Walter was my first professional mentor. And we're going to be talking about the Explorer program, how he influenced myself and others, and we'll be interviewing others, and we'll be talking about how the Explorer program of yesterday really set up the leaders of today in public safety. Walter, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me on the program with you, Marcus.
Can you tell our listeners what your origin story is?
I grew up initially on the west side of Chicago, near Chicago and Pulaski. From there, we moved to the northwest side by Belmont and Central. Before we moved, I was a student at Our Lady of the Angels School, which had a severe, tragic fire in 1959, where a lot of students lost their lives. I went there a few years after the fire, and when we moved to the northwest side, I went to Rheinberg School and then Foreman High School.
Very good. So why did you want to become a police officer?
Well, that's kind of a complicated question because I didn't really want to be a police officer at first. I wanted to be an astronomer. And to be an astronomer, you had to have certain educational requirements in school. One of them was a second language. And the recommended second language for astronomers was Russian. And when I was going to Foreman High School, they did not offer Russian as a language course, but they did offer German, which was the second recommended language. So I took 2 years of German, and in my second year of German class, one day, German teacher was sick. We had a substitute teacher instead. The substitute teacher was actually a off-duty Chicago police officer. He wasn't teaching us any German, but he was telling us what it was like to be a cop in Chicago, and I was enthralled. I thought, wow, this sounds like a great career if I change my mind or if astronomy doesn't work out. And while I was researching astronomy jobs for the future, I discovered that the only decent paying jobs in astronomy were for professors in colleges and universities. And I really didn't have an interest in being in school the rest of my life, so I gave more and more thought to going into police work. As a result, I ended up joining the Chicago Police Department 15th District Explorer post. So that's how I got involved with law enforcement. I focused on taking police exams as I got older. Skokie was one of the first places I tested, and I got on the list, and I got hired.
I did not know you were an explorer, and I've known you for 35 years. Now, I was going to ask you, well, how did you get involved in exploring, but you just told us. So what year did you get hired on Skokie?
July of 1978.
And you worked there, if memory serves, about 33 years before you retired? 34?
Just shy of 32 years.
Okay, which is a long, long time. And throughout your career, you've had several special assignments. Can you tell our listeners about what you did and how you impacted the community?
Most of my time was on the street as a uniformed patrol officer, which I really enjoyed. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed that. I did have a couple of specialized assignments. One was working as a TAC team officer, so we worked plain clothes, unmarked cars. We'd have special assignments like stakeouts, but most of the time, it was just aggressive street patrol. We would look for potential problems. We came up with so much activity working on the TAC team. Drug arrests, stolen cars, weapons. The problem is, whenever you generate an arrest, it generates an offense report. So as a result of all these extra arrests that we were making, it looked like the crime rate in Skokie was skyrocketing. So the administration decided that our crime stats were too high, so we better put these guys on the street because tickets were down. Back to patrol, so that, like I said, that didn't last very long. one of the other things I did, I was a part-time, then a full-time DARE officer. So I got to teach 1 or 2 days a week in local schools. I taught the DARE program, and then the rest of the week I was on patrol in the same areas where the schools were at that I taught in. I did that for several years. 2 of those years were full-time DARE officer, at which time I was assigned to the crime prevention unit, but I was not a crime prevention officer, but I did do crime prevention work up there. I was strictly a DARE officer working in schools. And one of my other assignments, a fun assignment, was a recruiting officer. I would go to job fairs at colleges and universities in the Chicago area and promote police work and law enforcement to those schools. Students there would ask me questions about what it was like going into law enforcement, and I'd answer questions. I'd talk to people about potential careers at our police department specifically. One of my favorite assignments, though, was doing something where I would come in on my off hours in the evenings to run the Explorer Post program. I was an Explorer advisor, and I basically worked with high school kids, young adults, from 14 through 21 years of age. Basically showed them what the inner workings of law enforcement and specifically police work were like. Gave them opportunities to see what it was like to be a police officer, day-to-day routines. I'd take them on ride-alongs. We'd schedule ride-alongs with each of the explorers that were interested. The program wasn't to push young adults into law enforcement. It was just to give them an inside look into law enforcement as a career. If they wanted to go into police work, that was fine. If they didn't want to go into police work, that was fine as well. My goal was just to give them an inside look, a realistic view of police work, so they could make an informed decision on their own.
Very good. And a lot of what the program entails is leadership training. So the subsequent interviews that we're going to be doing on the show are for both law enforcement professionals who have excelled in their careers and people who are in business as well. Sometimes people will go to the Explorer program, like you said, and say, you know, I really like this police work, but it isn't for me. And that's what I did. I went into this, I really wanted to be a cop, but after my father passed away, I made the decision that I did not want to work shift work and I wanted to be with my family. So that was an influence that he had. One of the funny stories was that when I was a police explorer, I'll never forget this. The first time you stopped at my house, I don't know if it was a drop off, something to say hi. It was about 9 o'clock at night during the week. And all of a sudden there's a knock at the door and it's the police. And holy cow, it's the police. And he came in, maybe had a cup of coffee or something, and we visited, and my parents visited with you. And I found out later that all the neighbors were peeking out their windows asking, what did Marcus do? Why is there a cop at Marcus's house? And of course it was me and not my sister. But what lighthearted and funny stories can you share about the program that you've experienced?
Marcus, there are so many fun stories. Probably the best way to tell a story is to leave names out of it. But I remember going to a conference one time. We had annual PACE conference, President's Area Conference on Exploring. Those were big events. They were fun events, and we'd have Explorer posts from several states sometimes, and hundreds of explorers, lots of young adults, and probably half the posts were law enforcement related posts or fire, EMS, aviation. Out of all those young adults going to these programs, 2 things really stand out. One was when one of our explorers was asleep while we were driving to the conference. He's fast asleep and he's kind of sprawled out. He's got his head backwards, and one of the explorers borrowed lipstick from a female explorer and put lipstick on his lips. He had no idea what was going on because he was asleep, and when he woke up, everyone was laughing because he had nice bright red lipstick on. He didn't realize it. It was all in good fun. On a serious note, most of the explorers went on to be very successful in their own personal lives. Many of them did go into law enforcement. many went into their own successful business pursuits, and I'm very proud of each and every one of them.
The Explorer program, at least in Skokie, the youth that were in there, including myself, we learned about law enforcement. We were given insights. We practiced, not in real life, but in training. We practiced traffic stops. That was always a fun time where we would learn how to do that, what to look for, what the dangers were. But the Explorers also volunteered at community events. Can you tell our listeners what type of events they volunteered at and what was their role at those events?
Well, the Explorers volunteered for many programs, carnivals in Skokie, Festival of Cultures. Emily Oaks had educational programs at their center. We had a fun run every year, Skokie Spirit Fun Run. There was an American Cancer Society fundraiser, a tour of the North Shore. They participated in all kinds of community events. These are some examples. And they'd help people in parking lots. They'd help direct traffic in parking lots. They help out with information, manning information booths, and just answering questions, helping senior citizens, to and from their cars.
We also raised funds. I can't remember his name, but there was a Chicago police officer who was shot and paralyzed, and we did some car washes and sold candy bars. And I remember as a 15-year-old explorer, you're given a quasi-police uniform, and I would go door to door. And someone called the police on me because they said a suspicious-looking Hispanic, and I look nothing Hispanic, but that's what they said. A suspicious-looking Hispanic was going from door to door robbing everyone. And here I am. I'm in a police uniform. Police officer pulled up. It was John Hammond, and he just saw me, and he couldn't stop laughing. So I went up to the car, and I said, "What's so funny?" And through the tears that are rolling down his face, he asked if I was the suspicious-looking Hispanic robbing everyone. And then I gave him a candy bar. It was just a funny story. In the Explorer program, there are multiple pillars of learning. Can you discuss what some of them are and what the Explorer program did to fulfill those pillars?
Some of the things the Boy Scouts of America expected us to do as advisors in the Explorer program were to promote these pillars of the program, one of which was outdoors. We also had physical fitness. The program had to be, of course, career-oriented, and our career orientation was law enforcement, but there are many other careers in the Explorer program. And services, so volunteering for community service. So we did all those things. We volunteered for many public service events, like the ones I mentioned. For physical fitness, every year we'd go on at least one ski trip. Our ski trip of choice was to Chestnut Mountain in Galena, where I got to help teach many of my explorers to learn how to ski. And for me, that was a fun event. Not that I'm a great skier or anything. I enjoy skiing, but I've fallen down more than my fair share of times. And that's how you learn how to ski. It's also how we learn to walk as babies. We fall. And then we learn not to fall. So same thing with skiing. That's a fun event. It was an outdoors event. And it was also a physical fitness event. One of the other components was education. What I'd like to do to satisfy that requirement, since I was so interested in astronomy, I would set up some of my telescopes in the employee parking lot several times a year and invite the explorers, if they wanted to meet in the parking lot, we could observe through the telescopes. So I'd point out things in the telescope like the moon, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, things of that nature. So they got to learn some things about science and astronomy. And every once in a while, we'd also have a field trip to Northwestern University, which is home of the Dearborn Observatory, a very famous place with a very famous telescope. And they'd get to look through a much larger telescope there and learn more about the skies and science.
It's a fantastic way to bring your original interest and it doesn't sound like those two kind of mix, but you were able to accomplish that.
I do know that we were very successful. We had a lot of very intelligent, innovative explorers in our program. And most of the time, these are local high school students. There's something that drives them. It's not necessarily their upbringing, it's not necessarily their environment, but rather it's a combination of many factors that lead these young adults into wanting to play a positive role in their community. They want to serve others. Some end up going into law enforcement, some end up going into the military, and as I mentioned before, some go into business ventures for themselves and are very successful. Whatever it is that drives them, that's what drove our program. It was the individuals that made our program great.
Very good. I do know of one person who also went into politics and was elected either as a state representative or a state senator in Illinois. Walter, in your retirement, what do you do now?
I like to focus on astronomy. Astronomy, it has been a driving factor in my life since I was about 8 years old. So what I do now, everything centers around astronomy. Even my day-to-day routine involves astronomy. I'm an astronomy researcher. I work on projects, investigating, writing papers. I have 20-something published papers in peer-reviewed journals. Right now, I'm working on my first book. I'm also going to star parties, specifically the Nebraska Star Party and the Okie Tech Star Party. So these are basically amateur astronomer get-togethers where astronomers from all over the country and sometimes other countries as well will show up to very remote dark sky locations and socialize in the daytime, outdoorsy type things during the day. And then at night, they stay up for most of the night to look at the sky through their telescopes or binoculars. Dark sky locations are becoming more and more scarce. I do participate in many astronomy events. I run the Galena Astronomical Society as its president, so I have public observing events that are free to the public during the spring through fall months, once a month.
How can someone find out about these events? And you said free to the public. How could they attend?
For the Galena Astronomical Society, which is held at the Galena Territory Owners Club, you can go to galenaastro.webs.com, and that has our schedule or calendar of events. And my personal website is trentadue.webs.com. And I try to update people on what I'm doing currently, as well as a little bit more about my background.
Can you spell your website for the listeners?
WTRENTADUE.WEBS.com.
As a police explorer, obviously you got interested or continued your interest in law enforcement. How did being an adult advisor, a leader to the explorers, how did that affect your life, your career, and your perception of the world?
That's a great question, Marcus. I didn't realize it at the time, but running the Explorer program, working with young adults each week was quite a gift to me. Looking back, it's very clear to me what I couldn't see while I was doing it. But looking back as a teacher, I was being taught. I was learning from my very own students, from the explorers. I was learning to be a better role model. I was learning to be a better educator and instructor. Here I am teaching the DARE program while I was working, and I'm working with high school students. I'm thinking down the road, some of these future explorers are going to go into law enforcement. Some of my current DARE students are going to become explorers. And it opened my eyes to see tomorrow's leaders today. And I had the privilege and honor of working with those students, tomorrow's leaders. And I was helping them. I wasn't trying to change the way they think. It was never about politics. It was never about good versus evil. It was a career choice for many. It was an educational experience for me. It was an educational experience for the young adults that were explorers. I accomplished my role to them into giving them an inside look into law enforcement as a possible career. As a result, I became a better teacher. Looking back, that's what I really see, that I learned from my students.
What a wonderful story. What final thoughts can you tell young people who are listening to this who maybe want to go into a career in law enforcement or at least a broader career in public safety, which is more than just law enforcement, but what final thoughts can you share with our listeners?
Well, law enforcement is certainly a wonderful career. You're giving yourself your service to others to help them, and that's the ultimate goal, to do the right thing to help people. Many times we're not dealing with criminals, we're not dealing with crime, we're dealing with calls for service. In police work, probably 80-85% of the calls are service calls. The remainder, some of the remainder are criminal in nature, maybe 5%. The vast majority of calls are calls for service. So exploring kind of explores what it's like to provide service to the community.
Thank you very much for taking the time with us. You certainly, not just because you said it, but you certainly impacted dozens of today's leaders. I'm one of them. And we're going to be talking to a couple of other leaders and interviewing them as well as additional segments to this program. Walter, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Marcus.
In continuing our discussion about the great successes of Explorer programs, I have Marie Lapidus, who was an Explorer prior to me, and there was a little bit of overlap when I started. Marie, thank you for joining us today.
I'm glad to be here. Hello.
Can you tell everyone what's your origin story? Why did you get involved in the Explorer post? Did you want to go into criminal justice, public safety? And give us an overview of your career and how you got to where you are today.
Oh, so loaded. Okay.
I can repeat it. It's like four questions.
Many questions at once.
So how did you get involved in the Explorer program?
Our friend Denise was in my high school class. I think she was actually a year ahead of me, and she was friends with my best friend, and she dragged us into the post and said, oh, this is fun, and we went to the first meeting, and then we're like, okay, and it was kind of an exciting after-school activity for us. We weren't too involved in school. I mean, we were on the forensics team, but most of it was the Explorer program, and so we met Denise in high school, and she kind of dragged us into it, but we enjoyed being dragged into the program. I don't think there was any necessarily intention of being a police officer, but there's so many more things to policing than being a police officer, as we found out through the Explorer program. So there were some inclinations of maybe doing like CSI type of work. But then I didn't do too well in college with chemistry, so that went out the window. Although my first goal was to be an what did I call it? A biochemical astrophysicist, because I wanted to find life on other planets. And so when I used to say that was just craziness, right? But now, if I would have said that, people have now accepted the fact that there's life on other planets. So whatever. My backup was the CSI kind of thing, and I was like, well, or I can do that. But then chemistry didn't go too well. So
I want to define something. You're talking about CSI, and in high school you were in forensics. That's the speech team.
Yes.
So
not the same thing.
Yeah, it's not the same thing. I just wanted to clarify. Oh, she was in forensics in high school. No.
It was the speech team.
I did that for a year.
Yes.
I didn't. It wasn't for me.
We were not very successful. Al and I did a comedy duet. And yes.
That's awesome.
But it got you in front speaking, right?
Yes.
And taught you some tricks and maybe hopefully be a little bit more confident when you're public speaking. So it was definitely a positive. So we were not a huge success in our endeavor. I think our best, we got 5th place. And that's because we actually did have a really funny play, but a lot of people didn't get it. It was very feminist for the time.
Tell us about your college major and what you did career-wise.
Oh, college major. I had so many. So I did start out in biochemistry. And then obviously I didn't do too well in the science. I went into actuarial science because I was told, oh, well, you're good in math. Go do that. And that was supposed to be the least stressful career that they published. So I was like, okay. Well, it was very stressful because you had to take all these tests. And I didn't want to I took the first test. I didn't do very well on it. And I was not successful. I actually failed out of U of I at that major. But I had already applied on a study abroad. So I did. And then I came back and I was like, they told me, go see the dean. You're not allowed to register for any classes because they let me back in. I wrote a sob story then. And I came back and the secretary just stamped and said, okay, go register. You don't have to talk to the dean. U of I is big. They don't really care. Then the only major that would take me at that point would have been either French or political science. And I was so stupid. I thought, what am I going to do with a French degree? First of all, who cares? So I will recommend for everyone, as having been in academia now most of my life, whatever degree it is, it doesn't matter. Do whatever it is that you want. Because ultimately, where you go to school for undergrad, what degree you got to get skills. And that's the key. The degree itself is irrelevant, in my opinion. So I said, I'm not going to do French, which I could have graduated probably within a semester after that. And I stayed, and the only department that takes people is political science. They take everyone, even the failures. And so I got into political science, but I really wanted to major in econ. They told me you cannot major in econ because your grades are so bad, but if you bring them up, you can switch the last semester into the econ program and graduate.
When we return, Marie will continue our discussion on her career path and how exploring has helped her. After that interview, we're going to be talking with Mark Hornstein, who recently retired as the chief of the Winnetka Police Department. Mark and I were explorers together. Stay tuned. The views expressed are not those of local community broadcasting, WYML LP, or its management, volunteers, or underwriters.